Chapter 6. Reunion. Although desperate to see her husband and son, Abigail dreaded the trip across the ocean. "I am so much of a coward upon the water," she said. She would be leaving behind friends and family whom she might never see again. She put Charles and young Thomas in the care of her sister. Her 19-year-old daughter, Nabby, was going with her. In June 1784, Nabby and Abigail boarded the ship the Active with trunks of clothes, 2 servants, and a cow. The ship's name was appropriate. It tossed around the sea. Abigail and Nabby were seasick for days. They couldn't even get out of bed. They were cooped up in a tiny, stuffy, dark cabin. It didn't help that the ship was dirty. Its cargo of whale oil and potash smelled terrible, and the dampness made Abigail's bones and joints hurt. The food was awful. Once she was well enough, Abigail tried to help the cook make better meals. She also got the crew to scrub the floors until they could finally see the boards under the dirt. Abigail wrote, "I am more and more of the mind that a lady ought not to go to sea." After a month, the ship reached the coast of England. Even then, the trip wasn't over. The passengers were lowered from the ship into a small boat. The waves were 6 feet high. The small boat washed up sideways through the roaring surf onto the beach. After that, it took an entire day by carriage to reach London. On the ship. If you saw the Active today, you would think it was a very small boat to be crossing the ocean. It was a sailing ship built to carry cargo and not passengers. There were only 2 tiny passenger cabins, both used by the women. The male passengers slept in the main cabin, where everyone also sat or ate. The passenger cabin doors opened right onto the main cabin. Even with the windows open, it was too stuffy to close the doors. A curtain gave the women some privacy, but they waited to change their clothes until no one was in the main cabin, and that didn't happen often. The cargo on the Active was smelly enough to make anyone seasick, even without the rocking of the waves. When Abigail wanted to go up on the deck to get some fresh air, she had to be helped by 2 men, because the boat rocked so violently. Then on the deck, they had to tie her to a chair. In London, Abigail and Nabby were met by John Quincy. Abigail was shocked to see a 17-year-old man. Her son had been only 12 when she had last said goodbye to him. Later, her husband John arrived. What a joyful reunion! London was a pleasant surprise for Abigail. It was sunnier than she had expected. Buildings were beautiful and the streets were wide. Best of all, there was indoor plumbing, not outhouses. The happy Adams family spent 3 weeks in London seeing the sights. Then they crossed the Channel to Paris. John had rented a mansion just outside the city. Abigail had loved London. As for Paris, she thought it was the very dirtiest place she had ever seen. The mansion, however, was another thing. It was beautiful. It had more than 40 rooms and came with 8 servants. There were huge formal gardens with fish pond and orange trees. Their life there was filled with dinner parties, the opera, museums, theater, and ballet. The lavish dinner parties of the France made Abigail a little nervous. It was too much. She was also shocked by the ballet. The costumes were too skimpy, showing the ballerina's legs much more than a lady from New England thought proper. It took a while for Abigail Adams to get used to the French ways. Abigail liked French women because they were smart and free to say what they thought. Still, Abigail missed home, and it was hard not knowing French. She got a pet songbird to keep her company. Then, as had happened so many times before, John had to move because of a new job. He would be the new ambassador to Great Britain. He and Abigail would live in London. Goodbye, pet songbird. Goodbye, Paris. Goodbye, John Quincy, too. He went home to study in America. John's job in England was difficult. As ambassador, he was expected to make friends with the very people who had recently been at war with America. And England was a powerful country, so the United States needed its friendship. When Adams met King George III, they were polite to each other. Nabby and Abigail also met the king. They spent hours getting dressed for the occasion, and then waited hours for the king to speak. Just a few words to them. They were not very impressed. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was in Paris at the same time as the Adamses. They became very good friends. Abigail even took care of the Jeffersons' daughter Polly when she first arrived in Europe to live with her father in 1787. Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States, right after John Adams. It was at that time that Jefferson and the Adamses had a falling out over politics. They barely spoke to each other for years. However, when Polly died in 1804, Abigail Adams wrote to Jefferson in sympathy. Eventually, the friendship was renewed. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams became very close again in their later years and died on the same day, July 4th, 1826. It was exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Abigail loved being back in London. She loved seeing the plays by Shakespeare that she had first read as a child. She was awestruck when she heard the beautiful music of Handel performed. She also loved visiting the countryside and stately homes outside of London. On one trip to Southampton, Abigail took her first dip in the sea. Abigail and John took a long trip to the Netherlands. Abigail admired the simplicity, honesty, and politeness of the people there. Wherever she was, Abigail believed her main job was to help her husband. In England, Mrs. Ambassador arranged dinner parties at diplomatic receptions. She was very good at it. But Abigail and John feared they were gaining weight. Nabby, meanwhile, married John's handsome secretary, William Smith, in 1786. He had the same name as Abigail's father and brother. The next year they had a baby, William. Abigail was a grandmother. John was a grandfather. Oh no! She exclaimed. She didn't like to think that she was old. The London newspapers were hard on John. They still hadn't gotten over the war and gave false reports about his speeches. Abigail called them news liars. John felt he was unable to get things done. It was time to go home. By then, Abigail was happy at the thought. It had been almost 4 years, and she missed her sons, Charles and Thomas, and her sisters. Also, the Adamses had asked an uncle to buy them a new, larger house in Braintree. It was to be ready for their return. In March 1788, they began another rough ocean crossing and reached Boston in June. To their surprise, they were greeted in Boston by thousands of cheering people, cannons, and church bells that rang all day. It was a hero's welcome. John and Abigail were overwhelmed. Best of all, they were finally home, together.